Hello and welcome to this season of Try This on Wisp Sports. I'm your host, Dr. Kirstin Lauritzen, and today we are going to talk a little bit about chronic inflammation. I know that we've talked about inflammation a lot on this podcast, but I'm hoping that it's going to serve as a bit of a reminder, maybe a bit of a check-in. You're going through your season, especially in triathlon. You might have already raced this year, or maybe you have your first race coming up. And this is just going to serve as a bit of a reminder to just look at some things, check your system out, maybe do a bit of a scan, see how you're feeling, and hopefully will be a helpful resource for you as far as like determining different causes of what can cause like chronic inflammation. And some of these are things that you do in like your day-to-day life, and you may not even think about them or notice them or think about them in this context of them causing chronic inflammation. And what really, what we're going to talk about today in this episode is figuring out and determining if chronic inflammation is ultimately what is either keeping you from performing, or if it is, potentially leading to you experiencing some fatigue or some aches or injuries or some other things that might be, basically causing some issues for you that, you're just not being able to perform at your absolute best. So after some time of working with a few athletes now over the past couple of years, more than a few, I was taking some time to kind of look back at the past couple of years and look and see if I could find some themes of what type of athlete typically comes to work with me. And what I figured out is that, and you might identify with this, you might not, but you may also know somebody that might be kind of in this category as well. But if you are or have ever been in a place where you felt super, super fit, but fatigued, like things just were not quite going right, but you were ready to go for your races and like you were definitely very fit, but there were aches, pains, just either fatigue or some other type of symptom that as you got to race day made it harder and harder to be able to really feel like you were going into race day feeling super healthy and strong. That's a very, very common scenario. That fit and fatigued athlete is a very common scenario that a lot of my athletes have presented as or with when they've come to work with me. And here's the thing, like you are likely training and doing everything that you can, or, you may also have tried a lot of different things as well. Like you may have done a lot of different lab tests and a lot of different screenings, especially if you have anything going on with like joint pain and inflammation or aches. Most people have had X-ray, CT scans, MRIs, trying to figure out what's going on there. You might have also tried a lot of different types of diets and programs that haven't necessarily helped, or you may have tried a lot of different types of like PT or those types of things that haven't necessarily helped at all. And, after trying all of those things and still dealing with a lot of the issues from that, you might be feeling a bit stressed about it. You might be feeling a bit anxious and maybe a bit defeated. That's definitely something that athletes have said is that, after trying so many different things and working on this for so long, it just feels like there's never going to be a solution or an answer. And no matter what you do, it's just not helping. And what we're going to talk about today in this episode is I'm going to show you basically what the most common causes of chronic inflammation are. And again, like some of these may surprise you. They might be things that you're doing in your day to day, and then exact steps so that you can know what to do about it, especially if you're not in it right now and it might be an issue in the future, you can know where to start. So typically when an athlete is kind of in that fit and fatigue state, dealing with some chronic inflammation, you might be experiencing one of these things. First, you've dealt with recurring injuries at least 3 times in the past year, some of which maybe haven't been solved by other like hands-on methods like PT, chiro, sports medicine, stuff like that. You've spent time out training or time out from training for at least 4 times in the past year because of maybe being sick or some other type of illness. You might have also potentially taken an entire year off if you had or if you have autoimmune disease or that flared up during a season. You've been fatigued in your day-to-day and workouts in the past 3 months and have also noticed other symptoms like joint pain or muscle aches or shortness of breath. You might have also experienced some type of GI distress, like you can't really seem to solve the gut pain, bloating, cramping during triathlons that are causing you to do the kind of what I call the aid station bathroom hop to the finish line. That's extremely frustrating. And I've gone through it before and have had these symptoms in at least 2 or more races in the past year. Or you may have also noticed that when you go to the bathroom, you've noticed either constipation, so not going to the bathroom for more than 2 days in a week or more, or even the flip side of that, having loose stools pretty often, and even seeing maybe the stool stick to the sides of the bowl. And that's all been happening more often for over the past 2 months or more. Those are all scenarios where if you were like, oh my gosh, that's me, then you're definitely going to want to pay attention and listen to this podcast, because we're going to talk about what are some of those drivers of chronic inflammation and what's causing a lot of that to happen. So, and here's the thing too, like we've talked about this as well, but like being an athlete is an inflammatory endeavor, like regardless of the sport. It's just, and I know that we don't really love to hear that. And I know this is something that I've talked about a few times on this podcast as well, but regardless of the sport, like the amount of training and the amount of stress that goes through the system when you are trying to train for things like triathlons and long distance endurance events, like your Ironmans, events that are going to be lasting 9+ hours or 6+ hours or more, any of those types of things. But also if you are in the category of being a professional athlete, you're likely training for several hours in the day. And you may also have some different stressors that I'm going to talk about here as well that are associated with a lot of professional athletes that have a tendency to be traveling a lot and doing certain things in their lifestyle and day to day that are correlated with just basically increasing chronic inflammation and might be causing some of the chronic symptoms that you have. So first off, what are some of the drivers of chronic inflammation and what are some things that we want to look out for? Number one, things like overtraining would be one. Other areas that we would want to be looking at as well is like inadequate recovery. So if you are, not spending enough time recovering, that can be a very, very big cause of that low grade chronic inflammation that just tends to stay there and then can be increased or compounded upon by different other things that are going on as well. And it just tends to kind of like be there and then sneak up on you. Another driver of chronic inflammation is calorie deficits or any type of dieting or anything like that. Those, or even in some cases, food sensitivities. Another driver is oversupplementation. So taking too many supplements, which can be very hard for the body to remove. You have to think about it like this. Like, yes, we're going to use supplements in some cases in order to have a very, it can be very effective to use supplements in certain cases. But the goal that we want to have is to use food first and then only use the supplements that are absolutely needed, but it also needs to be very specific. We don't want to use any type of generalized like multivitamins or things like that. We really want to be specific about what we're adding into the body. And part of how you could do that is by looking at labs. But that's over supplementing can end up leading to more inflammation because everything that you put into your body, your liver has to remove. It has to get rid of it. So we also have to think of the impact of the things that we're taking. The other thing as well that can cause chronic inflammation is frequent or daily use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So looking at things like ibuprofen or any type of Nsaids, those types of things, those are going to be medications, drugs, over-the-counter anti-inflammatories that we want to be really careful of, because if you're using them frequently, like daily or often, several times, several days out of the month or more, we need to be really careful because, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but frequent or daily use of NSAIDs is one thing that can definitely drive up chronic inflammation. Also things like jet lag or fatigue from travel. So this is really common for our professional athletes because they're traveling a lot, oftentimes, and sometimes they're on the road for extended periods of time. They're spending long periods of time away from home, and just even being away from family and from their home can be an added stressor that can then also lead to a bit of chronic inflammation. So we need to be considering what the impact of the life of an athlete looks like and what that impact can be on the body. Also, looking at things like sleep quality, like lack of reparative sleep, increased stress, anxiety, including performance anxiety, as well as chronic pain or injuries, and even toxins from the environment. And that's not necessarily even an exhaustive list, but those are just some things that we do need to be thinking about. And if you've noticed, like if you were like, oh yeah, that's that, I've got that. Yep, that one. If you were like, oh yeah, one of those are me or more, then what we might want to do is just take a step back and see if there's some things that you might need to be doing in order to help support your body to reduce inflammation. And the whole point of all of these is if you have one or more, they may be continuing to produce low-grade inflammation, which is something we want to be very careful with. So just an example of what I meant by like frequent or daily use of the NSAIDs. So like things like ibuprofen and things like that. They do help with acute inflammation, but when they're taken frequently, they can actually increase inflammation because of their effects on your mitochondria and on your gut bacteria, your gut microbiome. And what ends up happening is because of the negative effects on your mitochondria, which are your energy producers, these guys are super important for athletes, and our professional athletes have been shown to have a high density of very quality mitochondrial function. So if those start to be impacted, we can see a lot of issues come out of that for not just performance, but also for overall health of the athlete. And one of the things that happens when you've got this increased inflammation from things like NSAIDs and frequent use. I'm not talking about like, oh, you've got something, you needed to take it for a couple of days and then it's gone and you don't touch it again for, another 6 months or a year. I'm talking about like if you're taking this multiple times a month, many days out of the month, potentially even every day, we need to be aware of the impact that can have on the system. And what ends up happening is because of this negative effect on the mitochondria and also on your gut microbiome, you actually end up causing increased oxidative stress and a decrease into detoxification. So the body ends up becoming more toxic, as well as starting to see more and more layers of that stress on the system. And all of that can lead to a breakdown, like the different systems as well, like so energy, fatigue, right? As well as joint pain, muscles, inflamed joints, potentially even low back, serious issues like herniations, injuries, things like that. That's like just one example out of the many, but like jet lag, fatigue from travel, like all of those things are kind of obvious because they're going to reduce your quality of sleep, right? It's hard on the body to travel. So, if that's the case and if you're like, okay, well, I kind of fall in that category, like what can I do? There's a couple of things and there's a few steps that you can go through to see if, this is something that you might need to work on. So number one, and this isn't going to apply to everybody because I realize that not everybody is able to work with a functional medicine practitioner, but labs are a really good place to start. And you actually have quite a few options. You can go to your primary care physicians and you can order certain labs that show you quite a bit as far as what just your standard labs, like standard checkup labs, your cholesterol panels, your normal complete blood counts and metabolic panels and some hormone panels. All of those can show you so much, especially if you can add like vitamin D and B12 and C-reactive protein. All of those together they can give you a ton of information. They can give you a ton of information about what is happening inside your body. I also use other panels that show us the quality of your mitochondria as well as your fatty acid levels and your gut microbiome. And I use those to see what else is going on in the body. But if you don't have access to those, I would just go to your primary care physician and ask for some standard labs like the ones that I mentioned. And then at the same time, you can ask them about a couple of things like CoQ10, supplements called CoQ10 and adaptogens. So, and as I mentioned, like you would want to talk to your doctor about these. I'm not your doctor. I'm just giving generalized things that you might be able to look into, but you do want to discuss with your doctor to see if it's a good fit for you and it won't interact with anything that you have going on. So one of the things that I will use with some of my athletes is CoQ10. It is used by all of your cells, and it's also used by organs that need a lot of energy, like the heart, like the kidneys, like your liver, because you have a very high density of mitochondria in those organs. So CoQ10 really helps to support the health of those mitochondria so that you can actually produce a lot of energy and the things that you need in order to be able to keep your metabolism up, keep your energy up, and all of those things that are very critical for optimal performance for athletes. I mean, like, we're not just talking about like energy in your day to day, but we're talking about energy throughout your entire game, your entire race, your whole sport, like all of those things. We're trying to resist your fatigue, right, in sport. So that's, and the thing is that like so many people look at that as a perspective of like, oh, well, you're going to get that resistance to fatigue from just training more and being more fit. But the thing is that there's actually a lot going on inside the body that contributes to resisting fatigue. And it's not necessarily through more training. It's actually through, things like your mitochondria and your gut microbiome and things like that. Another one that I will use as well with some athletes at very key points during an athlete's season, especially if they are, in the middle of their season. So it's very, very, very high stress. And that's often times too, when like a lot of athletes, you start seeing athletes start to get injured, and you start to see athletes missing games, and you start to see them, essentially dealing with signs of increased inflammation is during the peak times of the season, right? Because the resources that they have are starting to get depleted. And especially if they're not looking for these things, then we're going to, it's going to be an issue. So one of the things that we'll use is something called adaptogens. So those could include ashwagandha, rhodiola, ginseng. For some of my female athletes, I'll use things like schisandra and some others because they can help with inflammation and especially around like hormones and periods and things like that. Those can be, especially migraines that happen around the period and hormone fluctuations. That can be a really helpful one. But ashwagandha, rhodiola, and ginseng happen to be very great tools, herbs to use to help reduce stress. But here's the thing: you don't just like apply this willy nilly. You want to put it into an athlete's routine when you're also comparing it to how they're feeling, right? We want to make sure that the symptoms line up with the reason why you want to take them, because we don't want you to be on these all the time. But you might put an athlete on these if they are feeling like that fatigue is kind of setting in, like stresses and some of the drivers of chronic inflammation that we've talked about have started to increase, like that fatigue from travel, things like that. All of those chronic pain or injuries, toxins, calorie deficits, inadequate recovery, overtraining, they all are and can contribute to why you might do this with an athlete. Also, we would also be paying attention to heart rate variability trends and resting heart rate. Like if you're not tracking those for yourself, those are some things that you might want to look into, because heart rate variability and resting heart rate can tell you when your body is overloaded. And listening to that can be a really important piece. And that doesn't necessarily mean not training. It means maybe changing the intensity of the training that you're doing and making sure that you're optimizing recovery on the days when you're clearly having some issues with an overloaded, stressed body, right? It's using the data to along with how you're feeling to guide what you're going to do in your training, basically. Also, we would be wanting to look at sleep data too, right? Because sleep quality, those heart rate variability trends, and then also how you feel, all of those you don't have to do a ton of labs to base a lot of stuff off of that alone. And that's a ton of data to know how you're doing. But, you can also look at blood and urine markers depending on the labs. And we combine all of those together to make a very comprehensive plan for an athlete. But, if you're somebody that is just sort of doing some of this stuff on your own, then you might want to look into CoQ10. You might want to look into adaptogens, and then maybe look into seeing if you can get some of those labs from your primary care and see if there's some things that you might be able to look at, like iron changes and C-reactive protein, which is inflammation, and looking at your lipid profile and cholesterol. Like all of those things will give you a ton of information as far as what's going on inside your body. And that can then guide, what you want to do moving forward. So I hope that this was helpful. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Wisp Sports on all social media channels, and make sure to share this episode with anyone you think may love it. You can also follow me at Dr. Kirstin on Facebook and Instagram, and drkirstin.com. If you'd like to reach us with any comments or questions about the episode, you can at info@wispsports.com, and you can always leave a direct message with us over on social media as well. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be back in 2 weeks. We're going to take a break next week, but I will be back in 2 weeks, and I will see you then. Take care.